The Rainbow Warrior wasn't news. I think we had pictures in the paper and it arriving and a small story about its mission, but it wasn't news. I was working as a police reporter here that night shift at about 10 to 12, I think it was the time. It's hard to recall the exact time. And we heard something. We heard in this building, so how many blocks away? 4 or 5 blocks away, something. And then we heard the sirens, and as police reporters we heard the scanners, and we were on the move, so we were sent straight down to the wharf.
All of a sudden something comes across the police radio that Jonathan Dowling hears, something to do with something going on down at the Rainbow Warrior. And it wasn't clear yet as to what that was immediately.
You go down to the wharf and you just walk straight on. You walk all the way along and you're standing next to this sinking, turned on its side boat with all the activity around it. You know, now, of course, you couldn't get past the red fence for a start, but then, and also, once the police would be there'd be a complete cordon. It was a more innocent and relaxed time. So we were right there watching things. We were moved away after a while, but it was all happening, developing. No one knew quite what was going on. The Greenpeace people who'd survived were all sort of in blankets and huddled. There were police and ambulance and fire and so on, and no one quite knew, and it wasn't certain who was, or anyone was still in the boat. As we know now, there was. And it was probably a scene that no one should have been at, because who knows what else could have gone off if there had been a second limpet mine or whatever to sink it.
John Andrews, who was the chief reporter rostered on at the time, but he wasn't actually in the office when this came through. He was elsewhere, but he came rushing back in, and shortly after that uttered an expletive, and it said they'd blown it up. And then it was basically kind of action stations, really.
I got a phone call at home. I lived in St Mary's Bay, and all of a sudden the phone goes. It was a bit before midnight, and said there's been an explosion in a boat down on Marsden Wharf. That's all we knew. So I hopped in the car and took off down there, only to discover that one of our late shift photographer, who started at 4 and finished at midnight, was already there. He was shooting pictures. The Rainbow Warrior was sunk. Was listening to starboard down at Marsden Wharf, and there was people coming out.
The great frustration of this, and if you go back to the Herald's coverage that next morning, and of course we were writing for a paper deadline distributed the following morning. We had no access to digital, instant, any of the things we have now. We got quotes from the skipper as he was walking across to the wharf police station, as it was then, now a bar, and he told us about people he thought possibly missing, and his view of what could have happened. It wasn't much. He was on the move. He was walking with policemen. And we had other witnesses, people who had been down there on the wharf or in nearby buildings. But a lot of that was cut out by the senior editor of the time, who took over the story while we were all down there. It was very late at night for the Herald. That was, for a morning paper, being in your letterbox by 6 o'clock. This was happening 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. But yes, the editor cut out a lot of that material, and so we were, having done all that, were in the way of newsrooms frustrated a bit by the reality that hadn't made it. Would never happen now, because all would be used all the time.
The people coming off wrapped in blankets. I went down to shoot the boat again. Ben came back to the office to process his films.
We were scrambling, obviously. We had a very, very good police team in those days. Tim Murphy, who went on to be editor, and Michael Holland, his sidekick, were a crack police team, and we had a chief reporter who we referred to as Inspector Andrews because of his police contacts. So these guys were on top of the story. Plus another of our reporters, Karen Magnell, had very good contacts in the in the peace movement. So we were on top of it and getting good information both from the police and from the public and from inside Greenpeace.
We didn't know that there'd been French agents. We didn't know there'd been yachts up north and vans and so on at that point. But the next day was the break that really came for us, which was when we had a call that the police were at that Newmans van depot and had talked to 2 Swiss tourists.
2 days after the bombing, I was sent out to the Newmans camper van depot after we had a tip-off that police had been out there. Our police reporters were up at police headquarters at the time, so I guess there was no one else available, and they sent me. And at that stage, all we knew was the police had been out to Newmans. It turned out they'd put out a message, I think a standard message to motor caravan companies and hire firms in general about any suspicious persons that they could recall. And it turned out one of those, one of the Newmans employees, Becky Hayter, who I interviewed, was immediately suspicious about a Swiss couple, and she walked into work the next morning and talked to her reception, went up to her reception and says, you remember that Swiss couple? And the receptionist kind of said very quietly, they're behind you.
We thought, well, this is interesting. Does it link? We didn't know. Coincidentally, the police had a press conference that day in which they were parading the yellow rubber ducky, I think it was yellow, rubber ducky, to say, look, this is what we found tied up on the causeway at Kahu Bay, Hobson Bay, and wanted us to take photos of that and to publicise that to see if they'd get any evidence on that. While we were up there at the police station on the forecourt where they were pointing us in direction A at the rubber ducky, I noticed that there was a Newmans van being dusted in a police garage behind us. And so quietly said to our photographer, look, get a photo of that, we need that, which he did.
They'd come back. Alain Maffar and Dominique Prieur had come back to return the hired van early. And Becky and the receptionist kind of contrived ways to delay them while the police were called. And I think it took actually quite a while for the police to turn up, but they managed to do so by telling the couple they were entitled to a refund for bringing the van back early. And it turned out this was quite an important impetus for the couple to hang around. When I went back to tell the chief reporter all this, it was all very well received, apart from the fact I didn't have much of a description of the couple, which Inspector Andrews wasn't too impressed with.
And then we were able that next day to be certain that the police had seized that van, that they were showing interest, it was connected with the Rainbow Warrior inquiry. The interesting thing about that was that was the first of 2 nights that Detective Superintendent Alan Galbraith, who ran the inquiry, came down from Auckland Central Police Station to our offices here at Wyndham Street and demanded to see the editor, and was in the editor's office saying, you can't run this, it will damage the inquiry, there's international implications, there's security implications. And to his great credit, the editor at the time, Peter Shearer, said, well, you tell us what the effect will be. Tell us what will be negative and we'll consider that. And they couldn't come up with a coherent reason other than it was inconvenient to the police inquiry. So we went ahead and we published, and that was a story probably that really then put the whole thing, set the whole thing alight to what was really going on. We had a major kind of international visitors involved in this thing.
What I had and what Tim Murphy had gleaned from police up at headquarters, they were able to put 2 and 2 together, and that day, the following morning, we were able to break the big story that 2 of the bombers had been taken into custody.
Interestingly, people pretty instantly made the connection themselves, say on talkback radio, which was the gauge of things then more than, say, social media now. People made the connection pretty quickly that this must be the French getting into Greenpeace, and it's 1 and 1 equal 2. There's no doubt. And eventually it was harder to put that together, but the supposition from the public, as soon as they knew that there were French-speaking Swiss false passport tourists, and then when it emerged later about the Uvea yacht and others who'd been dropping in and out of here to prepare and be backup and so on. The public was pretty quickly made that call. The French media were very vibrantly involved once things started to look like there might be some connections there. And obviously, I mean, the obvious connection being Murat and the French testing. So they started to eke out a little bit. The French media in French Polynesia were also very active, and so there started to be that talk and backward and forward and agencies mentioning things. We had, we went down rabbit holes. We at one stage thought and had information that could be people from the French Foreign Legion, rather than, as it turned out, the DGSE. So we went some directions that weren't totally right initially. But as it became clear, when they had these people in custody, they had the two of them separately in two different motels in Auckland with two separate detective senior sergeants who were their minders, grilling them for some time to find out what they could find out. I don't think they broke them, but they were convinced that their identities were false and that they eventually found out who they were. It was the biggest story that I probably worked on, and I was there right at the start, which was at the wharf, but I was also there right at the end, and the end was when the two agents were transferred from Paramariman prison, and they were taken across country to Whenuapai Airport to be taken out on a New Zealand Air Force plane out of here, and there was lots of the usual running interference, as the authorities call it, to keep the media out of it. And cars were going in different directions to be decoys, and anyway, a car that held the agents went out, and I was in a Herald Honda City by myself in the middle of the night, and we raced across against what would have been a Kingswood or something in those days, across country, and of course I had no chance. But in the middle of that there was a big right-hand bend, and the Herald Honda City didn't quite go in the same direction as what I intended it to go, and we rocked tilted on our axis for quite some time. Fell back the right way, and we all carried on. But yeah, that was the thing, that they left here in the dark of night by a pretty shoddy deal that the government had made, that then the French even reneged on that. So it was from start to finish, it was a pretty dark story.